Danny DeVito's life story. Simple English version, you know. You want to be comfortable, and you want to have friends, and you want to be accepted. Like in the early days, being short, do you really understand the sad truth hidden behind the laughter that made Danny DeVito famous? Danny DeVito isn't just a legend. He's proof that greatness can come from being rejected, that the loudest voice in a room can come from the smallest man. He broke the rules about what a star should look like, sound like, or be like. Hollywood once said his face wasn't good enough, and his body was a joke. He changed the rules and made the world listen. When he played Louis De Palma in the TV show Taxi, he didn't just act, he roared through the screen, making his name part of pop culture history, with fire and passion behind the camera. He helped voices that no one else would help. He didn't demand respect. He earned it over and over again with hard work, talent, and a soul that refused to break. He gave hope to the outcasts, the flawed, the different, and stood taller than any award could make him. But the world doesn't see the sleepless nights, the broken hearts, and the deep need to be loved. He didn't just survive fame. He survived being abandoned, rejected by his parents, feeling alone, and the endless emptiness of love he never got. And just when everyone thought the storm had passed, that peace had finally come to him. A major change at age 80 left fans completely shocked. What happened to Danny DeVito will break your heart. Before we start, tap that like button to show respect for a man who turned pain into power. Every legend starts somewhere, but Danny DeVito's story began with a cruel twist of fate, a wound so terrible it followed him through every part of his life. It was 1944 in Neptune, New Jersey, and while the world celebrated the end of a war, a newborn named Daniel Michael DeVito Jr. came into life already marked by heartbreak. His mother, Julia, was tired at 40 and overwhelmed by raising children. She admitted years later with painful honesty, "I didn't want him." Few truths are more cruel, few scars more painful than realizing the person who gave you life once wished you weren't there. That rejection became a shadow wrapped around Danny's soul from his very first breath, weighing on every night of his childhood with a tragic heaviness no child should ever feel. Home was never safe, never warm, never gentle. During the day, his father, Daniel Sr., was charming to neighbors while running a candy store. But at night, alcohol turned him into someone unpredictable, loud, scary. The sound of bottles clinking became warnings of fear. The heavy sound of footsteps meant danger was near. By age 10, Danny had already learned how to survive, slipping into closets, running to neighbors, holding his breath in the silence of fear when bedtime should have meant safety. Between 1950 and 1955, police were called to their house at least 17 times, a terrible number that shows a boy growing up not with lullabies, but with terror over what each night might bring. Loneliness, cruel and cold, became his only friend. At school, he was much smaller than the other boys, a cruel hint of the Fairbanks disease that would later stop his growth. At 4 feet 10 inches, he was teased, stared at, treated like a circus act, instead of a child with dreams and feelings. By 12, he already felt like an outsider in every room. And decades later, he would admit, "I always felt like I didn't belong," even when success came. Outside his home, Neptune itself was falling apart with crime and despair. By the time Danny turned 14, 2 of his childhood friends had already been killed by the streets. Out of the 12 boys he once played with, only 3 would make it past 25 without falling into tragedy. Survival wasn't promised. It was a desperate gamble, and Danny, still just a boy, chose to fight for his own chance. At 14, he saved every precious dollar from cutting grass and odd jobs, scraping together $237, a heartbreaking fortune for a child who had almost nothing. With that money, he went to a parish priest, begging for escape, pleading with his parents only when his father was sober and his mother was softened by guilt. Against every odd, they agreed. That single moment became his turning point, one he later remembered with sharp clarity. Leaving at 14 probably saved my life. Boarding school at Oratory Prep wasn't paradise, but to Danny, it was freedom. The first time he could sleep without fear pressing against the walls. The first time hope felt real, and yet the pain never went away. At 20, while others his age chased love and dreams, Danny quietly dealt with the constant aches of Fairbanks disease, proof that even as he escaped one shadow, another followed him relentlessly, and decades later, well into his 70s, he still admitted that the echoes of rejection and fear never truly left, saying that even at the height of fame, he still felt like that small boy from Neptune trying to prove he mattered. Danny Devito's childhood was never innocent. It was survival. Every night spent hiding, every tear cried in silence. Every dollar he saved was a thread woven into strength. And while the world would one day know him as a roaring giant of comedy, those who look closer see the heartbreaking truth. He was a boy who rose from rejection, who built his strength in shadows, and who carried invisible scars no applause could ever heal. Escaping Neptune was only the first battle. Finding his voice in the world was the next. Every legend searches for a stage, but for Danny Devito, the search was brutal, filled with doubt and rejection. At 17, standing at the gates of oratory prep, he was ready to imagine a new life. But the cruel echoes of childhood still stuck to him. Smaller than the other boys, quieter, often mistaken for someone younger, he seemed destined to be overlooked. Teachers doubted his potential. Classmates saw him as comic relief rather than a real competitor. And yet inside that small body burned an intensity waiting for release. Years later, he would describe it with a mix of humor and truth. I didn't choose acting. It sort of kidnapped me. In his late teens, searching for direction, Danny drifted into his sister Angela's beauty salon. At first, he said he picked up the trade just to impress girls, cutting hair, mixing dyes, trying to look useful. But really, he was just trying to fit in, to feel needed in a world that had rarely told him he mattered. His own family never believed acting could be a real path. He had to keep that dream secret, yet fate has a way of showing itself. Customers laughed at his impressions, surprised by his timing and animated expressions. The salon became an accidental stage. I was just fooling around, he later admitted, but somehow people laughed, and I thought, maybe this is something. Began as a way to belong, became his first rehearsal for destiny. By age 20, restless and hungry for more than small-town survival, he enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York. The rehearsal halls were cold, the casting rooms colder. Directors looked at him with dismissive eyes. Too short, too odd, never a leading man. It was the same verdict his childhood had whispered, that he didn't belong. And yet, behind his grin, Danny was already carrying the secret pain of Fairbanks disease. By his early 20s, the rare bone condition constantly hurt his hips, back, and knees. The pain could reach a daily throb of 6, sometimes 8 out of 10. But he refused heavy medication, fearing it would dull the instincts he was only beginning to trust. Between 1967 and 1970, he auditioned hundreds of times, 248 rejections before landing a role of note. In that stretch, he earned less than $800 in acting work, a humiliating amount that barely kept him alive. Every no, he remembered, just meant I had to get better. But when the doors kept closing, despair pressed down as heavy as Neptune's nights once had. To survive, he scraped by with odd jobs, cleaning cages at a zoo, posing stiffly as a mannequin. In shop windows, hauling anything that paid a few dollars. He often slept in his beat-up Volkswagen Beetle, showered at the YMCA, and ate in church basements. On the outside, he joked about his bad luck. Inside, he fought loneliness, depression, and the crushing fear that maybe the world was right about him. In 1972, his father died, a man who had scared him, yet whom he had deeply respected. The loss shattered him, reopening every scar of rejection and leaving him ready to give up the dream entirely. There were nights I thought I had nothing left, he later confessed. But somehow I'd wake up and try again. These weren't glamorous years. They were years of grit, hunger, and strength carved in silence. Then, in 1975, came the role that changed everything. Through loyalty and luck, his former roommate, Michael Douglas, got him a part in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Martini was a small role, barely minutes on screen, but Danny approached it with the weight of his own life to prepare. He lived inside a real psychiatric ward, surrounded by patients, absorbing their mannerisms and silences. What audiences saw wasn't just acting. It was lived truth shaped by years of hiding in closets from his father's rage, years of reading danger and footsteps, years of surviving rejection. Martini was Danny's shadow come alive on screen. Those 5 minutes opened his doorway into Hollywood. Critics noticed the intensity. Casting directors began to see past the labels. Yet Danny was never fooled by the myth of overnight success. "People thought I was an instant success," he said years later. "But they didn't see the years I was broke, the nights I almost quit." By the end of the 1970s, the boy who once hid from footsteps in Neptune was standing at the edge of stardom. The industry that had laughed at his face, his size, and his pain was about to realize it had underestimated him. What began in rejection was turning into revelation. Danny Devito was no longer the outsider begging for a chance. He was about to roar his way into Hollywood history, proof that scars, persistence, and a refusal to disappear can build a career no spotlight can ever dim. Success in Hollywood is rarely gentle. It tests, tempts, and sometimes destroys. For Danny Devito, the climb was brutal, but the top was dazzling. In 1978, after years of hunger, rejection, and scraping through survival, he landed the role that would make him immortal. Louis De Palma in Taxi. At first, producers doubted him again. Too strange, too harsh, too short to hold America's attention. In fact, he had turned down 3 major film offers just to gamble on Taxi, a decision many thought reckless. But when the cameras rolled, something electric happened. DeVito didn't just play Louis. He unleashed him with intensity, wit, and a raw humanity that turned a cruel stereotype into a mirror of truth. The character was loud, rude, even hateful. And yet, through Danny's performance, viewers couldn't look away. Within 8 episodes, more than 11,000 fan letters flooded in. By 1980, he held a Golden Globe in his hands. By 1981, an Emmy. The boy, once branded unfit for Hollywood, had become a cultural icon recognized in 93% of American households. But, even at the height of triumph, shadows pressed close. Lewis's harshness wasn't just comedy. It was an echo of his father's rage, the chaos of his childhood. Repurposed into art. Danny himself admitted years later, "I poured my pain into Louis. It was the only way to make him real." What the world praised as genius was at its core a performance, born of scars, and yet, even as America embraced him, Hollywood still tried to lock him into the margins, casting him again and again in quirky, odd, or grotesque roles, refusing to see him as a leading man. Still, Danny refused to disappear into caricature. In the mid-1980s, he proved his versatility in Ruthless People, transforming from sitcom villain into a force on the big screen. Then came Batman Returns in 1992, where he became the Penguin, a grotesque, tragic villain who terrified audiences and critics alike. The performance cemented him not just as a comic presence, but as a serious actor capable of inhabiting darkness with unnerving truth. These roles pushed him into the global spotlight. Yet, they also underlined Hollywood's cruel double bind. Every triumph reminded him that the industry still saw him as the outsider, never the conventional star. Yet, stardom brought its own burdens. Hollywood, addicted to perfection, still whispered its cruelty. Executives once waved $1 million check for him to submit to surgery, facial reconstruction, leg lengthening, a full erasure of the man he was. Danny's response was defiance itself. He burned the offer on the beach. "This is me," he declared, "and I'm not changing." The world cheered his defiance, but behind the fire lay a quieter wound, the knowledge that even at his peak, the industry still wished to erase him. The 1980s and 1990s crowned him as more than an actor. He directed Throw Mama from the Train, The War of the Roses, and Matilda. That last film was deeply personal. He directed, produced, narrated, and even acted alongside his wife, Rhea Perlman. For Danny, Matilda wasn't just a children's story. It was a love letter to resilience, to finding light in dark families. But its intimacy also carried fear. If the film failed, it would feel like a betrayal of his own story. Every frame was a risk, every scene a mirror. His passion soon pushed him beyond the camera. With the creation of Jersey Films, DeVito gambled everything on independent cinema. Unlike the safe path of studio blockbusters, this was a battlefield of risk. The company's early projects lost money, and even allies doubted him. When he decided to back a then unknown Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, the gamble was terrifying. If it failed, Jersey Films would collapse, and Danny's reputation with it. He later admitted he lay awake many nights haunted by the thought of bankruptcy and humiliation. Every production meeting felt like walking on a tightrope above ruin. But faith carried him forward. When Pulp Fiction exploded into a cultural phenomenon redefining American cinema, the world hailed it as bold genius. Few saw the sleepless nights, the whispered fears, the truth that success had been one gamble away from destruction. But success demanded a hidden price. Grueling shoots stretched to 16-hour days, and by his 40s, Fairbanks disease gnawed relentlessly. At his joints, nights were sleepless. Mornings began with pain. Yet he refused heavy medication, terrified it would blunt his instincts. "Pain," he once whispered, "is just part of my day." To millions, he was unstoppable. In truth, every step onto a set was an act of endurance. And even when victory seemed secure, Hollywood reminded him of its cruelty. Man on the Moon, though praised by critics, collapsed at the box office, leaving Danny to taste the bitter truth of artistic success rejected by the masses. Behind the triumphs, exhaustion stalked him. The pressure to reinvent himself, to stay relevant in a changing industry, was relentless. He often feared not physical failure, but creative silence, the terror that one day the spark would die. And still, the cruelest irony of fame was this: no matter how high he climbed, Danny often felt invisible in the very world he conquered. At award shows, surrounded by towering leading men, he confessed he sometimes felt like a shadow. When the applause died and the spotlight dimmed, loneliness crept back, whispering that he still did not belong. "I always felt like I didn't belong," he admitted, even when success came. Yet in the end, he turned agony into artistry. By the late 1990s, his name was etched into Hollywood, not only as an actor, but as a producer of historic influence. He had redefined what a star could look like. He had given hope to those told they were too strange, too small, too different to matter. And while fans saw a roaring giant of comedy, those who looked deeper saw a more haunting truth. Greatness built not in spite of scars, but because of them. At the pinnacle of fame, Danny Devito stood as living proof that even the cruelest wounds can be transformed into a story the world can never forget. For all his triumphs under the spotlight, the truest battle awaited in the shadows, where love, not fame, would test him most cruelly. On screen, he was indestructible, a man who bent Hollywood to his will, who turned rejection into triumph and pain into comedy. But off-screen, behind the doors of his home, unfolded a love story that began like a fairy tale and ended like a haunting that would follow him for the rest of his days. It began in 1971, in the afterglow of a stage performance in New York. That night, Danny met Rhea Perlman, and the air itself seemed to crackle. Within weeks, they were inseparable. By 1982, they were married, and for decades, the world called them unshakable, a rare Hollywood couple immune to scandal, bound by love, wit, and a shared defiance of the chaos around them. Their home bustled with scripts and laughter, 3 children running through hallways lined with movie posters. At dinner, Danny might recount absurd set stories. Rhea would cut him off with sharper wit, and the children rolled with laughter. To outsiders, it looked like the perfect picture, proof that love could survive the glare of fame. But the same career that had saved Danny from obscurity slowly began to steal him away from the very family he built. Directing deadlines turned him into a ghost at the dinner table. Jersey Films demanded meetings at all hours. One empty chair at supper became 2, then 3. Rhea, juggling her own career, what began as a home full of noise began to thin into silence. They fought to save it. Vacations, anniversaries, family rituals, all were attempts to patch the cracks. But the cracks widened. Conversations shrank into arguments. Arguments collapsed into silences that lasted for days. Their children, once shielded, began to sense the distance, a glass castle about to shatter. In 2012, the shatter finally came after 30 years together. Danny Devito and Rhea Perlman separated. The headline stunned Hollywood. Fans could not believe it. But for Danny, it wasn't just the loss of a partner. It was the reopening of the deepest wound of his life. The words his mother once hurled, "I didn't want him," echoed louder than ever. For a man who had fought rejection on every stage, this was the rejection that cut deepest, to no longer be chosen by the person he had built a world with. And then, against the odds, came a flicker of light. They tried reconciliation, brief but intoxicating dot like rain falling on scorched earth. For a while, holidays were whole again. Laughter returned to the dinner table, and Danny believed, perhaps, broken things could be mended. But the hope was fragile, stitched together with longing more than strength. By 2017, the second split arrived, quiet but permanent. They never divorced, bound still by shared children and decades of history, but they no longer lived as one. To the world, it looked civil, almost gentle. To Danny, it felt like hope itself had betrayed him. The pain of losing her once was unbearable. Losing her twice was devastation. Friends whispered that after the second separation, he was different. Even at award shows, dressed in tuxedos among giants, his eyes sometimes wandered, hollow. He would laugh, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. More than once, he told friends he felt invisible. Now, with Rhea gone from his side, invisibility followed him home, too, which had shadowed him since youth, grew crueler with age. By his 70s, pain gnawed at him day and night, joints screaming at levels he once described as 6 to 8 out of 10. But it wasn't just pain. It was the grinding reminder every morning that his body was breaking as his heart was breaking. To millions, he was still the indestructible giant of comedy. In truth, he was a man crushed between two agonies, a body that betrayed him and a silence at home that refused to heal. Rhea never truly vanished. They still shared holidays, birthdays, family, gatherings. Photographs showed them side by side, still smiling. But Danny admitted that these moments cut the deepest dot every Christmas tree lit in the living room. Every birthday cake shared with their children was a reminder of what once was whole and would never be whole again. Love had not ended with betrayal or cruelty. It had simply eroded, like sand slipping through clenched fists. And that kind of loss, quiet and irreversible, was the most unbearable of all. This was the cruelest irony of Danny Devito's life. The man adored by millions hid in closets from his father's rage. As a man, he hid behind humor from the emptiness of a broken marriage. And so, while the world remembers the giant of comedy, those who look closer see something far more haunting. They see a man who carried applause in one hand and silence in the other. They see that his greatest performance was not on the stage nor on the screen, but in the living of life itself, enduring heartbreak with grace, facing rejection with humor, and walking through emptiness without ever letting the world see him collapse. Every legend carries triumph, but Danny Devito's legacy reminds us that even the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. And sometimes the most unforgettable story is not one that made us laugh, but the one that quietly breaks our hearts. The twilight of a legend is rarely peaceful. For Danny Devito, age has not softened the battles. It has simply changed their form. On screen and in public, he remains the same indestructible force. Sharp, funny, quick with a joke that can fill a room with laughter. His appearances on Jimmy Kimmel Live or late-night shows still send audiences into fits of joy. Clips of his antics go viral online, shared by a generation that wasn't even born. When Taxi first aired to millions, he is the eternal gem of Hollywood, the little giant who refuses to fade. But behind the curtain, age has pressed its cruel hand heavier with each passing year. The disease that shadowed him since childhood, Fairbanks disease, has grown merciless with time. In his 40s, the pain was a dull throb. Now in his 70s, it is a relentless fire. Joints scream when he walks. Mornings begin with a stiffness that makes even rising from bed an act of endurance. He has described the pain as 6 to 8 out of 10 on most days, but numbers cannot capture the weight of it. With a smile, where the world sees a man ageless in spirit, the truth is far more brutal. He refuses heavy narcotics, terrified they will cloud his instincts, dull the spark that has carried him through a lifetime of creation, so he endures it raw. Pain is not an occasional visitor. It is his daily companion. Friends say that before. Award shows or interviews, he often winces in private, takes a deep breath, then switches on the mask of humor as if flipping a light. For Danny, performance is not only art, it has become survival. Loneliness, too, lingers like a shadow. After his long marriage to Rhea Perlman unraveled, the house that once rang with the laughter of children and the rhythm of family life grew quieter. They remain close, still sharing holidays, birthdays, family dinners with their 3 grown children. But Danny has admitted that every gathering carries a bittersweet ache. The family is still there, but never again in the same way it once was. What once felt whole now exists only in fragments. At 80, he still lives in California. His Beverly Hills home, a mixture of comfort and ghosts. The walls are lined with film posters and family photographs, reminders of triumphs and wounds interlaced. Financially, his legacy is secure. Decades of acting, directing, and producing have left him with an estate valued at over $80 million, properties in Los Angeles, and investments through Jersey Films. Yet even this fortune cannot buy back time, nor shield him from the frailty of age. He has spoken of updating his will, preparing trusts for his children, not as a grim surrender, but as a final act of care. As friends and contemporaries pass away, Robin Williams, among the most painful, Danny, has grown more contemplative. He rarely speaks of grief publicly, but those close to him notice the silence that falls heavier with each funeral, each obituary. At award shows, surrounded by younger faces, he sometimes looks like a man carrying a history that few in the room can truly understand. The applause still roars, but when it fades, he returns to a house where the quiet feels louder than any ovation. Yet his defiance remains. He continues to work, not because he must, but because he refuses to surrender. On the set of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, he is the mischievous, fearless Frank Reynolds, a role that has introduced him to a new generation. But even that triumph carries its cost. Long hours leave him drained. Physical comedy, once effortless, now demands recovery days. Still, he insists, as long as I can stand, I can act. It is both a declaration of will and an admission of fragility. He maintains his health the only way he knows how. A simple Mediterranean diet, heavy on pasta, olive oil, and wine, daily. Stretches prescribed by his doctors and laughter, the therapy he claims is worth more than any pill. He jokes about death, calling it the final punchline. But beneath the humor lies a raw truth. He knows the clock is ticking. His hair has thinned to silver, his stature more fragile. But the spark in his eyes, the same spark that once defied Hollywood's cruelty, still flares when he talks about a new script, a story yet to be told. This is the paradox of Danny Devito's present life. Adored by millions, yet often feeling invisible in his own skin. Remembered for boundless energy, yet quietly fighting his body every morning. Celebrated as a legend, yet haunted by solitude when the lights go out. He once conquered Hollywood with defiance, but age is the one opponent he cannot outwit, only endure. And still endurance may be his greatest act. For even now, Danny refuses to collapse. He continues to create, to laugh, to fill the world with stories. Even as pain, nausea, and silence presses in, his twilight is not gentle, but it is unyielding. And in that unyielding spirit, he proves once more what his life has always shown. Greatness is not measured by ease, but by how one carries the weight of suffering without ever letting it extinguish the flame. Finally, Danny DeVito's story stands as more than the tale of a Hollywood star. It is the chronicle of a man who refused to let the world define him, even when it tried to erase him. His life has been a battlefield of pain and defiance, of triumphs, born not in spite of scars, but because of them. What began with rejection became resilience. What could have ended in obscurity became a legacy etched into film, comedy, and the very imagination of audiences across generations. His journey reminds us that greatness is not measured by height, wealth, or even fame, but by endurance. The ability to keep creating, keep laughing, keep standing, even when life tries to break you. DeVito transformed anger into comedy, loneliness into characters, and heartbreak into art that continues to resonate worldwide. He has proven that being different is not a weakness to be hidden, but a strength to be wielded. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: Legends are not built in moments of applause, but in the silences between them. When the world is not watching, and you still choose to rise, for Danny, the twilight of life is no longer about conquering stages, but about leaving behind a flame that will burn long after his body gives out, a reminder that mortality cannot silence the echoes of a soul that turned pain into laughter. His story forces us to confront our own fleeting time on this earth. What scars do we carry, and how can we turn them into something that matters? How do we define our own legacy, not by the ease of our days, but by what we create from the weight of our struggles? Danny Devito's life is not just to be admired, it is to be shared, reflected on, and lived through by others. Because every time we laugh at his characters, every time we are moved by his work, we keep alive the truth that pain, when transformed, can become light, and that even when the man is gone, the light will remain. What part of Danny's story resonates with you most? The triumphs, the scars, or the way he carried them?